Well, I am here with Stuart McFadden, who is co-founder of Refundee, and I am really delighted to be asked to host this interview to find out how Refundee can assist consumers who have experienced financial loss in schemes and scams in the wealth creation industry. Many of you will know that I've been involved in consumer protection in this area for over a decade, and as we're going to talk about, Stuart, it's largely unregulated, and whilst prevention is better than cure, if you do experience loss in the wealth creation industry, then there are very few routes of redress, and that's why I'm really excited to learn about Refundee. What is the service that Refundee can potentially offer somebody who has lost money to one of these wealth creation schemes and scams that we see, all over the social web?
As a start, there's two things that Refundee does. Well, actually, I'll take it back a step and start from who we actually take action against. Unfortunately, we don't take action against the fraudsters. I know that's what everybody wants, and we don't get the money back from them. The reason we don't do that is because it's a lot harder, because they know how to hide the money, they know how to get rid of it, and there's other processes to do that through the police or the insolvency service. What we look at is we look at two things. We look at the bank's obligation to protect people from fraud. So that's on a basic level, that's looking at what's going on someone's account, and if they think something's up, they might want to speak to the customer, talk about current fraud trends, and try and stop them from falling victim to a scam. But the one that's more relevant to this kind of fraud is most banks are signed up to reimbursement codes. Those reimbursement codes actually next year are possibly becoming mandatory and even more extensive than they currently are. What we look at is whether the banks are protecting customers under that first one, and we're also looking at whether banks are actually reimbursing people when they should do under these codes. And what we frequently see in this area is banks telling people that this isn't a fraud, when quite often it is.
And then you work with the customer to actually prove that there has been, a fraudulent activity. We'll talk about more about that in a moment. But we do know about bank chargebacks, which tend to be on credit cards, and that's one of the things that we always advise people to do, is if they are going to enter into one of these schemes, they should pay via a credit card, because there is a level of protection there. So how is Refundee different to these chargebacks?
We do rarely help with chargeback cases and Section 75, things like that. But mostly we deal with bank transfers. Yeah. It's a UK bank transfer. You have protection provided you're from one of the big banks. So most of the big banks are all signed up to this code, and you have protection under something called the contingent reimbursement model. That is a code where if you fall victim to a fraud, the starting point is that you get your money back. As long as you fit some parameters, like it only came into play on the 28th of May 2019, for example, has to be a transfer to another UK bank. The banks, to put it quite simply, banks have 3 get-out clauses, and when they don't have to pay people back. One of them is that it's not actually a fraud, because the code only covers fraud, it doesn't cover civil matters, and that's the one that frequently gets overused. Another one is they don't think the customer had a reasonable basis for belief. Again, that one rarely applies fairly to this kind of situation, because the scams are so convincing. Quite often there's Ponzi scheme kind of behaviour. It's usually very convincing and believable. The other one is if they gave the customer a warning, a relevant warning about this type of scam, and the customer ignored it, they can refuse reimbursement in those cases as well. But again, that rarely happens in this kind of case. Okay,
so what is the kind of definition of fraud in these instances?
So we use the Fraud Act definition. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it's something along the lines of a person who enriches themselves by dishonestly relieving somebody else of their funds, essentially. And that's quite a broad definition, and it can be quite subjective in terms of how it's applied quite often.
Indeed. So what criteria does a potential client need to meet before you will actually consider taking on their case and trying to help them get a refund?
It's a really difficult question, because it depends on the timing of the payment, it depends on the method of the payment, and it depends on the circumstances of the case. So, for example, UK bank transfers to another UK bank account, as long as you're from one of the big banks and all the banks that are signed up to this contingent reimbursement model, we can help in most of those cases, as long as the money was sent after the 28th of May 2019, which on or after the 28th of May 2019, which is when it came in. We can look at other cases as well, from any date and any payment method. it's just very different arguments. In those cases, I mean, I won't go into details of it, but one of the things we have to argue is essentially the bank should have blocked it, and the bank should have known that it was fraud and should have warned the customer if they kind of went into it with the victim. That can be quite hard in really convincing scams, because banks they're not expected to be kind of private detectives and amateur detectives, and go into it all day. They just need to know the most common current fraud trends, which at the moment are things like cryptocurrency, investment scams. They follow a very familiar pattern. It's easy for the bank to ask questions and kind of say, how did you come across it? And then it follows a very familiar pattern, so it's easy for us to argue it. When it comes to kind of big property investment fraud, it can be a lot more opaque. There's a lot of corporate structure around it and things like that, and so those arguments are generally a bit harder, but obviously we're happy to speak to people and point them in the right direction and talk to them about their individual case, to see if we can help them.
So when somebody gets in touch with you, you'll get some background to their case and their situation, and if you can see, you know, what you mentioned, a kind of pattern of fraud or evidence of fraud, what is their client journey with you?
So the first thing is someone will come through to us, either fill in a form on our website, email us, give us a call, and we go firstly through an information gathering exercise. One thing that we are very transparent about, and this will be on our website and everything as well, is that we tell people how to do it themselves if they want to as well. We talk them through the process, which is essentially taking the bank to the Financial Ombudsman Service. So we go through an information gathering exercise. Up front, we'll be honest about chances of success. It does depend on the case. We won't take on cases where we don't think it will succeed. That's simply because we're no win, no fee. So commercially, it's not very wise of us to take on lots of cases we will lose. But we do obviously take risks sometimes and test things out to see where they'll work. So once someone's signed up, we decide to take on the case. We essentially send a case off to their bank. Usually the bank will say no in most situations, and then we take the case to the Financial Ombudsman Service and present the case there. It's a reasonably slow process, but a lot quicker than other ones. So it usually takes between about 6 and 12 months to get a result.
And you've had extremely good reviews on Trustpilot, and I think one of the key things that I think is so important about your service is that you offer such support, because losing money isn't just about financial loss. It can be, you know, incredibly distressing and stressful, and have many, you know, knock-on impacts for people. And I think it's so great that your service is with that person through the process of trying to secure their refund from the bank.
The journey with Refundee, which is very different to the people that are like our competitors, is when you speak to someone on the front end, they'll be an expert. They'll talk you. They won't just sign you up and leave you in the dark. They will tell you exactly how the case is going to be fought all the way through. And the thing I'm probably most proud of with the reviews is, if you look, most of them are people that are happy they've got their money back.
Yes.
Because with Trustpilot, as you probably know, people often manipulate it, because they'll do things where, you know, you come through on the first time you've ever spoken to the company, they'll be really nice to you, and then the member of staff will ask you to review them. So a lot of companies will have seemingly good reviews because they've got nice staff on the front end. We don't do that. We only do it at the back end, which is why our reviews are nice in that sense as well. It's nice to see people getting their money back.
Absolutely. Now let's talk specifically about the property sector, because you're dealing with quite a number of cases at the moment, and you're dealing with cases that there's a lot of people involved, and that kind of creates a critical mass, doesn't it, which does help the process. In particular, JVs, joint ventures, very often where the person who is running the joint venture says that they're going to bring their experience and the investor will bring the money. So the person running the JV has no skin in the game, which I think is incredibly dangerous to a consumer and is a real red flag. But, you know, recently we've seen a number of very high-profile JVs go badly wrong, and you're hearing more and more from people that are involved in these kind of things. And initially, those are the kind of people that you want to hear from, people that have lost money in some kind of property scheme that may well turn out to have been some kind of Ponzi scheme. This
is getting to the point where it's absolutely, I mean, you know this already. You've seen this you know a lot more than we do. We're relatively new to this, but we've seen that this is a huge trend that seems to, well, I mean, it's been going on for ages, but a lot of them seem to be going bust now, and they leave behind a very muddy, unclear picture of what's happened, but there's starting to be really obvious signs, and one of them you just spoke about, people that don't have the skin in the game, quite generous returns.
Yep.
A lot of anecdotal stories about guaranteeing returns as well. Things like security that's not being granted when they say it is. The same like excuses that are always just whatever's going on at the time. So, COVID is what brought it all down. Yeah, COVID, Brexit,
cost of living,
materials,
inflation.
all this kind of stuff. And it's the same old excuses. And then it all comes crashing down, and it's all like, oh no, it just didn't work out because of all these things. But like if you look at it all in hindsight, and even the way the agreements are structured, so you'll see that sometimes the longer this business goes on, the longer term the agreements are, so people have to wait longer to get any returns. And I mean, there's a lot of them going on. We're hearing a lot of them, and they're all very different. It's getting to the point now where it's definitely a fraud trend that we're seeing, and they're huge as well, because they're so convincing. They manage to last for so long. People get paid returns early on as well, so it becomes it sort of snowballs into something huge.
And some of them are life-changing amounts of money that people have lost, even their pension pots. And this is why this sector does need regulating, because people are losing very, very significant amounts of money. And as we said at the beginning, there are very few routes of redress. And that's why, I personally, with my consumer protection work, was so pleased to hear about Refundee, that there is this option to get a refund from the bank. And you mentioned earlier, it's no win, no fee. So how do you monetize it?
Again, unfortunately, one of the things is we're not necessarily short of work. Because there's so much fraud out there. We're very transparent about how people can do it themselves. Our fee is capped at £10,000 per case, and we charge 15% plus VAT. It's no win, no fee. So obviously we only take on cases where, it's not like we only take on cases where we're going to win. We take on cases where we think there's a good chance, and we will fight cases really hard when there's a group as well. So that's kind of how we monetize it. And yeah, you're right. These scams all scams are horrible, and some people, I don't know how, but some people can just brush it off, but some people it completely ruins their lives. We have lots of cases where the loss is in the millions, for example, and therefore, obviously people could do it themselves, but a £10,000 cap on that kind of loss becomes a bit of a no-brainer to get help.
Now, you have had some success with getting a refund in one of these types of schemes that we've been specifically talking about in the property sector, haven't you?
Yeah, we've been successful, but generally, to set expectations, these ones are really hard fought, because they snowball, they tend to grow really big. And one of the things I forgot to mention earlier is actually we do cases quite often against the bank that received the money, because if you take a step back, the banks have signed up to codes and people should have protection, but logically you think about the receiving bank and some of the behaviour that's going on in those accounts, and you just wonder how something hasn't popped up along the way. So because of I'm convinced it's because the exposure is so big, the banks will fight them all the way, which means yes, sometimes you do get early refunds, but what we're seeing so far is just banks will, whenever there's any kind of lack of clarity, they'll just say it's it's not a scam, it's a civil matter. And that's what makes it really difficult sometimes, and really unfair for people that are trying to represent themselves, because as a lay person, for example, you wouldn't know the contingent reimbursement model exists, and quite often banks won't even tell you about it, because they'll just say, yeah, sorry, there's nothing we can do, it's a civil matter, go speak to trading standards, or some other useless
utterly
advice.
Toothless as well.
Yeah.
And you're also keen to tell people to report these things to Action Fraud as well, because again, it's a kind of critical mass. If enough people start reporting them, then the police will have to start to take some kind of action.
Yeah, so we're experts. We know how the Financial Ombudsman Service looks at cases, and they they largely do a great job holding banks to account when they don't apply the rules. But what we aren't experts in is which is what actually the Property Tribe's website can be quite a useful source for, is kind of doing that. We obviously do it, and we are working actually with private investigators at the moment on some of the ones where we have less evidence, but we rely a lot on customers to feed us the evidence, and we'll do things like we'll speak to insolvency administrators, we'll try and speak to the police and pull together a story. However, where people have had most success in the past is where the investor groups are the most organised. And there's two things that I would say is, like, there's so many of these scams at the moment. Everybody knows the police are completely underfunded when it comes to fraud. There's even public acknowledgements of that by the police, which is a huge shame because it, as we said, it's like going out of control. So what I'd encourage people to do is, even no matter how much you think it's a waste of time, if you think it's fraud, report it to Action Fraud, because the more that's essentially a database, and when there's a critical mass, like it might mean the police actually investigate it, and that could be huge because it goes from a case where it's completely unclear whether fraud has occurred to there's now a police investigation and they're now getting evidence and they'll look into it, and they might even say it's fraud and make arrests, which is great. There was a company called Accumulate Capital, which is quite similar. And they had a really organised investor group, and the person that led that did an amazing job of, for example, there was an insolvency administrator that was appointed first of all, who they didn't feel was up to scratch or doing a good enough job, and they managed to get that one changed, and got a proper insolvency administrator who was really going to look at what's going on, who then went on to confirm that it was fraud, and that massively helped them, because later that, a year down the line, when you're arguing at the Financial Ombudsman Service that this is fraud and should be covered, everyone's in a much stronger and much better position if they've got the police taking action and they've got insolvency administrators who have properly looked into things. So if I had something for people to think about, it's like, try and get organised in your investor groups, and if you've got someone who is really good at that kind of thing, make sure you're thinking about whether that insolvency administrator is really fit for purpose. Are they in kind of, there's even suggestions they're in cahoots with the scammers quite often, and they need to get them changed if they're not good enough, because that can really mess things up.
Well, that's extremely good advice. I think some of the areas that I hope that you'll be able to look into and maybe support consumers is in the area of rent-to-rent and deal sourcing. Again, when somebody pays for something and then they don't actually get it. I hear of that frequently. Again, totally unregulated, although the government is looking to regulate that sector, thankfully. And the other one, of course, is the property education and mentoring area, where people pay a lot of money for education and mentoring. It can be in the tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds. Frequently they're missold what they're actually going to get and what they can achieve in reality. So those are two areas that you will also kind of consider as well, aren't they?
Yeah, so certainly the former. We've had examples of that. We've had success in those cases. You think, and again, there's a variety of how easy those cases are to win. So we've had ones, for example, where somebody said, oh, well, this is the property you're investing in, and then we've done land registry searches, and then the person never even owned the property who said they were doing things like that. They're quite easy. But on the latter, these are traditionally quite hard cases, and a lot of it depends on how organised and how clearly the customer can communicate what they were initially told, because the fraudsters are experts at just confusing things. They know what they're doing. Quite often the course is made out to be more of a disagreement about the quality of the course, rather than an outright fraud. So for us, it helps if people are really clear on what they were supposed to receive, what they actually received, whether there's other people in the same boat, and just really obvious examples of dishonesty can help us. We are testing out some of these cases at the moment, but they are a lot more difficult to get through our process, because it's not like where there's bricks and mortar that you can talk about and you can see whether what's happening would have happened, but when it becomes to a course, a lot of it's quite subjective and it's not tangible, so it's quite hard to prove fraud.
Indeed. Well, Stuart, it's been really interesting speaking to you and hearing about Refundee, because, as you said, it's only really been possible to do these bank refunds since around 2019, so it's a relatively new way of redress for people, isn't it? So if people feel that they can relate to this interview in some way, that they've lost money to a scheme or a scam, very simple to get in touch with you, isn't it?
It's very easy, yeah. The easiest thing is to just, we have a claim form on our website you can fill in any time, and someone reaches out to you after that. But yeah, there's details on our website how to get in touch. So if people want to help, they can do that. And of course, if they just want to chat to us about their case, see whether it's a go or not, even if they want to do it themselves, we are very transparent about that as well.